was a lot of persecution. In Babylon, however, life was good. And there was a flourishing, there was a flowering of intellectual thought, of branching out from biblical interpretation into the sciences, into jurisprudence, into law, into how the Jewish community is going to interact with the larger community. All of these ideas are starting to be encapsulated through a series of individuals, different leadership classes that we have here delineated time-wise. So in your outline, under the word Talmud, you see that there was a group of men called the Sophrim, and they are generally dated by scholars as between the years 450 before the Common Era, okay, so 450 up until 30 BC. This is a class of people who were inspired by what happened during the captivity in Babylon. Judaism became portable, and they wanted to develop this. However, they recognized that it needed to have an authority. The authority had to be written. It begins with Ezra the scribe. Ezra is a good guy. If you were faced with the task that Ezra was faced with, you would have done the same thing. They're there and they have to kind of pick up and start all over again. Whether it was in Babylon or when they came back to Eretz Israel, they now had to kind of reinvent Judaism. They recovered the books of the law. There was a dramatic reading of the books of the law. It needed to be read to people in Aramaic because that was the language for 2 generations that they had known. But ultimately there was this back to God movement on the part of a portion of the people. And so they wanted to have a way to have the scriptures explained to them. That works if you have someone there to explain it. But what if that person is not there? So Ezra and the others start to write down some guidelines. These were like devotional books. These were like commentaries. Nothing wrong with that, as long as they stay true to the text. But once you start playing telephone, you know what happens. A message that started out straight and clear on one end becomes anything but on the other, as people start to add to it, take away from it, embellish it, and it becomes very garbled at the end. Folks, that's essentially what happens here with the process of Talmud. There is an initial desire to do the right thing, to take the Word of God and answer people's questions about how do we keep Mosaic law. Again, remember, this is a group of people who are seeing themselves as being bound as an obligation. They're bound to Mosaic law. They have to keep it. Again, these are people who had sided with the community that rejected the Messiah. So you have, with the Bar Kokhba revolt, you have the final break of church and synagogue. They've now gone different ways. But in essence, both groups are not staying on the straight and narrow, neither of them. The synagogue is going off kilter because it has rejected the Messiah. The church is going off kilter because it has rejected the roots of its faith and is now bringing in all sorts of legalism. True believers are rare. Occasionally you can find them. But again, they're not the ones writing the history books. That's probably why they are not there. They existed in the mountains. I'm sure there were individuals in Syria and other places in North Africa who were genuine believers who perpetuated the teaching of the apostles. But eventually, as these false churches picked up steam and got bigger and bigger, those people were persecuted. They were seen as heretics. And so with Judaism, you now have a push to develop a written sort of system. You are well aware from your studies in Life of Messiah about the increasing clash between Yeshua and the Pharisees. and the fact that he would say to them, you make of no importance the things of God because of your traditions. The nice traditions that Ezra and all those good scholars had initially developed around the year 400 BC, when their students repeated it, and when their students repeated it, and when their students repeated it, they added on to that. And so you've already seen the illustration of fences around the law and fences around the fences. Ultimately, someone started to recite lists of all those fences in an oral narration, in an oral law. We talked about Torah be'al peh, Torah from the mouth, that this had become, in many sections of the Jewish community, even more important than Torah that is written. Their traditions took preeminence in all that they were doing. Ultimately, that oral law, which was existent during the time of Messiah Jesus, that oral law, people were saying, we want to see it on paper. And the early rabbi said, no, he whispered it in our ear, and he said, don't write this down, but instead just pass it on. Ultimately, people were not happy with that, and of course these fellows wrote it down. And so you have these successive groups here, and both on the PowerPoint and in your notes, you see the groups. The Sofrim is the earliest group. The Tanaim, we're dating from about 30 BCE through 217. With 217, you have the appearance of a very significant person in Jewish life. You have the school of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai establishes, when he's able to do so, he establishes a school, and that rabbinical school will have a great deal of influence. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, of course, was the individual who was smuggled in a coffin out of Jerusalem during the siege. He convinces the Romans to let him go, that he would be a help to them because he's going to encourage people not to revolt. Yochanan ben Zakkai, in your notes there, under 2b, establishes a rabbinical yeshiva at Yavne. If you've ever gone to Ben Gurion Airport, you've passed by Yavne without knowing it. But that's where it is. And so at Yavne, he says, I'm just going to live in peace, establish a rabbinical school. To do what? To promote and teach the traditions of the elders. The very thing that Jesus clashed with the Pharisees about. That's what he was all about, Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he is going to establish this rabbinical academy at Yavne. Ultimately, you have, after about 100 years, you have an individual called Yehuda Hanasi, Judah Hanasi, who becomes the individual who at the end of this period of time actually takes out quill and parchment and starts to write out the core of the oral law. And the core of the oral law is known as Mishnah. And so you now, with the start of the Mishnah, you have this third group, the Amoraim, 217 through 427. This group starts to undertake a new task, and that is they are going to write a commentary on the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was already seen as being authoritative. The Mishnah was the rule that Judah Hanasi had laid down, and now the question arose, how do we obey the Mishnah? Because the Mishnah is not a very large set of writings. Okay, the Mishnah is not like the Encyclopedia Judaica or Britannica. It's relatively small, which means there are a lot of situations it doesn't directly address. To the rescue comes Gemara, or just to muddy the water comes Gemara. So in the 4th century, 5th century, you have schools in Babylon who are busily involved in the process of collecting the commentaries by different rabbis on the Mishnah. Now, I need to hip you to something that is a current issue of anti-Semitism, and it revolves around Gemara. If you root around on some websites that are anti-Semitic, one of the things you will surely come across are quotes from the Talmud that purport to say it's okay to do these evil things. For instance, there is a discussion in Gamara. Gamara is, and by the way, understand that Gamara basically records conversations between various rabbis over certain points in the Mishnah. So you have, the Mishnah was just a small section in the middle of a page of Talmud, and then in sections, and I'll illustrate it in a bit, in sections around Mishnah, you have the discussion of the rabbis, and that forms the Gemara. The discussion of the rabbis is a classic thing. You have two rabbis in the room, you have three opinions. Typically, you'd have 8 rabbis in the room, and it would be a cacophony of disputes. There is no single teaching in Gemara. Anything you want to prove in the world, you're going to find a passage in Gemara that seems to support your crazy idea. Because again, Gemara is like an ocean. It is like the Encyclopedia Britannica. It is immense because it records without saying who's right and who's wrong. It records disputes. It records debates. For instance, one of the things that is most common on this anti-Semitic websites that you'll see is they'll say, do you know that the Jewish rabbis are in favor of the violation and rape of underage girls? What in the world are you talking about? Of course they're not. But they are, the anti-Semites will come back. And every day, I get an email, because I have various email addresses that show up on websites. I run various ministry websites, and I have various email addresses. Those of you who are my friends are always confused. Well, what email address do I send this to? One of the email addresses is a public ministry email address. Those of us in ministry get added to all sorts of mailing lists we have no desire to be on. I was recently added to a very anti-Semitic mailing list. In the first email, I noticed that he had added lots of Messianic groups to this list. This is a guy who is not Jewish, but he grabbed a Jewish name. He grabbed the name Goldberg, and he actually writes under that false name, but he is just regurgitating the vomit of previous generations of false stories. So what's this story about, the rabbis have no problem with rape of underage people? Well, there is a debate in the pages of Gemara where the rabbis are discussing this issue of what should be the punishment for a man who is found to have violated an underage girl, a very young underage girl. A horrible situation. It's a horrible crime. It's a horrific idea. Our mind reels. We are repulsed at the story. A number of the rabbis in the room having the discussion were repulsed. Some said, no, that's the death penalty. Others were saying, no, lock this guy up for 20 years. Some of them had suggestions about what to do with his anatomy. That's as euphemism as I'll get. And so there was a debate in the room. One guy would yell, the other guy would yell, and they were old. One guy dared say, no, all he has to do is pay a fine of 200 pieces of silver and promise to marry the girl when she's older. The other rabbis in the room said, you're crazy. We don't agree with that. Why are you even here? That's what they said. What does this anti-Semite quote out of this whole discussion of the Gemara? He only quotes that one crazy suggestion by this one rabbi, which was quickly denounced by all the other rabbis, but he quotes it, he puts a mask around everything and quotes it as though it's the opinion of the rabbis in the Talmud. This same sort of dishonesty is now rampant because of the internet. 30 years ago, if you wanted to publish a book with anti-Semitic nonsense like that, you would start making the rounds to publishers, and there were gatekeepers at the helm of responsible publishing houses, and the gatekeepers were editors, various levels of editors that had a brain, had been around the block, were educated, and as soon as they read that, they said, "Get out of my office. No, we're not going to publish this book." And so this anti-Semitic author would make the rounds lower and lower. He'd wind up in the seedy section of town, and ultimately some guy in a print shop said, "Sure, I'll run off 100 mimeograph sheets for you if you give me money." So these sorts of lies 30 years ago were relegated to the seedy section of society. Today, anyone with $100 with a little knowledge of web design can put up a website that looks legit. Put these crazy ideas out there, and they wind up getting hooked up with people around the world who also have the same feverish nonsense afflicting them. Anti-Semitism then infects young people. You have young people who read this stuff, and they can't discern the difference because they don't have the world experience. And that is one of the main things, and we're going to touch on that late next week as to one of the reasons why anti-Semitism is growing. But that is the lie. And let me then say something uncomfortable. There is a subset of some conservative evangelicals who have bought into that set of lies. And they actually believe that Jewish people should be blamed for the ills of the world. So whenever you have some sick Hollywood producer who's found to be molesting individuals, and his name is notably Jewish, for them, that just confirms their bias. Of course, they pass over the 99 people who are not wealthy, who don't have Jewish names, who also were convicted of the same crime that month. They focus on the one prominent Jewish individual. Very sadly, in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been some prominent cases where there have been some Jewish individuals caught up in this thing, and they are right now in prison, rightly so. But it gives ammunition to the anti-Semites. And we began talking about this because in Talmud, these liars, because they have no concern for the truth, if you're a believer, talk the whole truth. Don't get me started on what I see on Facebook, what some believers are willing to do to try to advance a political cause, and they partially quote one thing a person has said, ignore all the rest, as though one person is an angel and everyone else are devils. And unless you vote for this one person, you're probably not a Christian. Well, that's really not honest. We're told to, first of all, be honest. God is truth. Let God be true, but every man be found to be a liar. And we need to be truth tellers. No matter how heated the election gets, we need to tell the truth. We need to recognize that our hope is not in any politician. Our hope is in the Lord God of Israel. We need to stand for righteousness when nonsense threatens to overwhelm our society, when people are saying men can be women, women can be men, and all that young children should be allowed to choose their genders. Well, that's a refutation of common sense and, by the way, of science, because the chromosomes are there. But we live in a society where sanity along with morality has been thrown out the window. So yes, we do need to stand for those things. But to imagine that one politician is somehow going to be the savior is simply not true. So just a word to the wise with all of that. So here in the Talmud, you have the seeds of people who are going to say anti-Semitic things. Why? Because they cherry pick. They pick only the stuff that fulfills their already existing bias, and they ignore 95% of the other material in Talmud. Guarantee you, if I put in front of you a good translation of Talmud, and there are several good translations of Talmud into contemporary English. I recommend to you the Steinsaltz Talmud. He did a very nice translation. There are several other good ones. You would probably read that and agree with significant portions of it. Other portions you would say, why are they arguing about a single drop of milk possibly being, flying across the room and going into a pot of stew? There are several pages about that particular catastrophe. What do? Do you throw out the whole pot? Do you try to scoop out the drop? I'm serious. And so all of these are codified there in the Gemara. By the way, Mishnah is primarily written in Hebrew. Gemara is primarily written in Aramaic. The last group here, Seborayim, no, that's not a scalp condition. That is the last group of individuals who finally polished up the Gemara. And so there you have those four groups that made up the Talmud. Here in the overhead, you have a little bit of an illustration of a typical page of Gemara. By the way, sometimes you'll hear the phrase, the Jerusalem Talmud versus the Babylonian Talmud. What's the difference? It's not really important at this level. They both use the same Mishnah. Mishnah is always the same. It's the central Hebrew portion. So in this page, it would be the central portion found there, but the Mishnah will oftentimes go on for several pages because the discussion of Gemara on that Mishnah portion goes on for several pages. So they keep repeating the Mishnah portion, but the Gemara portion changes. And so the Babylonian Talmud is immense. The Gemara section, it goes on and on endlessly. Whereas in the Jerusalem Talmud, a version of Gemara written in Jerusalem, it's much, much smaller. But sets of the Talmud are very prominently found in Orthodox Jewish homes. It's a very large book. The set of books that you see there in the illustration, each one of those books is probably around 18 inches by 12 inches. They're hardbound. They look very impressive on the shelf. And if you go into some yeshivas, you will see endless shelves from floor to 10-foot ceiling. If you go into the Lubavitch Chabad Yeshiva on Eastern Parkway, not far from where I grew up, they have 12-foot ceilings in the main room there. And it's filled with various editions of Talmud. And so Talmud becomes the rule book that answers the questions of what do we do? How do we live our lives? And Talmud becomes central to all of this. There are certain principles regarding the use of Talmud. And you'll see at this point we're kind of off the printed notes, but we're talking generally about Talmud. And so we say there that Talmud is the rule book for living life as a Torah-observant Jew. Please don't slip into the mistake of imagining that Talmud is a commentary on the Bible. It is not. There are principles in Mishnah which talk about Mosaic law. How do we live out these principles in Mosaic law? But it's limited to just the 613 commandments found in Mosaic law, found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's not a commentary on the entire Hebrew Scriptures. It's really the rule book for living life as an Orthodox Jew. What is permissible to wear? What is permissible as an occupation? What if you are wealthy? How much money should you give to the poor? I mean, in minutiae, it goes into attempting to answer these questions. By the way, the canon of Talmud closes around the year 550 or so AD. After that time, people said, well, let's kind of write a commentary on Gemara. Let's write a commentary on the thing that's a commentary of something else. And so you have all these. So now you have categories of literature known as the responsa. In various countries, rabbis received written inquiries from people. And the Jewish community is scattered around the world. So you'd write to some famous rabbi in Morocco or Spain, and you'd ask your question, and it would take months to get there. You would hope it got there, and then he might take a year or more to respond. So you might get your response back in perhaps 2 or 3 years. People treasured those responses and gathered them into volumes of literature, and those are still used today. Responsa are still being written right now. There are various rabbis throughout the world, maybe about a dozen or so, who are seen to have authority to the point where they are still writing responsa. And their writings are being collected and circulated in the Jewish world. Again, we want to remind you, as it says here, you'll often find conflicting points of view in the Gemara section. Some views are rejected by the majority, and as we said, anti-Semites often misrepresent Judaism by quoting bizarre minority views, as in the illustration that I shared with you. Again, see the big picture. When the Bible says one thing and the Talmud says another, Orthodox Jewish folk imagine they can't understand the Bible directly, they need the Talmud. And in that way, it becomes very similar to classical, traditional Catholicism, where it was felt that you could not read the Bible directly. Bible reading was not encouraged until recent years. Instead, you were encouraged to ask the priest everything. In the absence of a priest, you had a catechism. I saw a catechism printed like in 1910 in Baltimore, and it's extremely narrow. This is the one and only answer. The questions were narrow, the answers were narrow, and if you were a good Catholic, you arranged your life by that. We say here, much to the chagrin of many in our Israeli contingent, that Talmud study is a full-time job for many of the Orthodox. There are riots every few months by Orthodox men who don't want their young men conscripted into the Israeli army. Israel is a small country facing many threats. And so you need to have a good standing army. Many of those young Orthodox men are able-bodied. They should be in some capacity in the army, but there are simply large groups of them who do nothing all day but read and study Gemara, passing it on to a next generation. And so Talmud study, that's a big controversy right now in Israel, because the government subsidizes some of these rabbinical academies, which is not something that many of you are happy about, I know. And so these rabbinical academies are certainly against believers. They imagine that they are the only authority on Judaism. So if you want to get married, you have to go through them, all kinds of things. And so fortunately, some of the more reasonable Orthodox folk there are actual units in the Israeli Defense Forces that are made up of Orthodox Jewish people. They do very well. They have slight modifications to accommodate kashrut and all those other things. But we say there that the Orthodox look down on Jews who do not know or follow Talmud. And I experienced that myself many times in Brooklyn, because the next neighborhood over was very Orthodox. So we're going to pick up tomorrow in Roman numeral 15, talking about the Mohammedan period, which in its early years was not as bad as you might imagine. So that's where we'll pick up tomorrow. Thank you.